Hello and welcome back to another video in the Leadership Journey video series. I'm Kit Alowitz and I've got the esteemed Dr. Matthew Chodkowski with me today. Matt, welcome to the show.
Hello, Kit. Good to be here again.
Matt and I have made a number of videos together, and today we're going to make another one. Today we're going to talk about culture, and we're going to specifically talk about it in the context of two words: consciousness and communication. And I've got a couple questions for Matt, being kind of the resident expert on all things leadership and culture. So Matt, I find that when you ask someone about culture, they typically revert right to the simple, maybe it's even a slightly lazy answer of, it's how we do things around here. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could talk to a little bit about how those kind of all link up together, that how we do things around here, consciousness, communication. Speak to it if you would.
Okay, that's a good opening, Kit, because I think you're right. A lot of people, when they hear the word culture, they immediately think of this term that's been around for maybe 50 years, how we do things around here. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about how we do things, you're thinking about behavior usually, right? But we have identified the word consciousness. So really what that gets to is that the key to culture is how we think around here, not so much what we do around here. So that gets us right into the consciousness piece, because thinking, cognition, and that's the connection to the consciousness piece. So think about it. Consciousness, you might say, well, that means we're awake, but there's a lot more to it than that. Obviously, if we're sleeping, you could say that we're, unconscious. But it starts off really, what is consciousness? It gives us the ability to focus our attention. Mm-hmm. When you're focusing your attention, you know that you're conscious. But it doesn't stop there. It only begins there. So then focusing attention takes us to the ability to observe reality and to make sense of our reality, maybe to give it meaning. Doesn't mean that we're going to be accurate, but that consciousness allows us to focus our attention and then to observe and make sense of what we're observing. So then that takes us to the creation of what sometimes is called heuristics, but let's call it a mental model. Mm-hmm. So we then start to construct these mental models in our mind that make sense in our own way of perceiving. So when you think about it, this is critical to culture. And consciousness, it takes us right to that, almost that ontological level of reality. What really exists? We could be wrong, but at least we're making sense of what we believe exists. So now we've got this mental mindset, let's call it even a paradigm if you want. What's it consist of? Well, we've got beliefs, we have assumptions, we could even say that we have principles that would be associated with that. That takes us to now the next step of perceptions. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit different. When we start now to perceive things, those mental models act like filters. And our concepts will now kind of dictate how our perceptions operate. So it has a lot of power over our perceptual abilities. So this takes precedent. Consciousness will then create these mental models, the paradigm. We look through the paradigm, and now we make sense of other things. So what does that have to do with consciousness and knowledge? Well, that's where knowledge comes from, right? It's our observing reality, making sense of it, creating some kind of principles and ideas. So knowledge is a big piece. How we make sense of the world, you could use that as a definition of our knowledge. So the raw materials for consciousness are assumptions, beliefs. We can also say values. We could throw principles there, okay? So then we have to say, okay, if this is connected to the second ingredient of culture, which is communication, what's the connection? Does that make sense so far?
I like it. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I liked how you kind of unpack that and put some meat behind this as well. So I'm going to ask you to put some meat now to the second component of culture. So we talked about consciousness. Matt gave a nice description there. the next part of it is communication. And it seems like, Matt, when you ask someone, hey, do you know what communication is, or describe it, they'll immediately go to, they'll always say, yes, I understand what communication is, and then sometimes they just put some very superficial to kind of descriptions of what communication is. And from what I understand, there's lots of aspects of communication. So if this is the second part of culture, could you put some meat to the bones in terms of what is communication and how can we get our arms around it?
Yeah. So we know already, based on what we said, that you couldn't communicate if you didn't have some consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. So we've got the consciousness precedes communication. What's the point of communication? It's transmitting our ideas from our consciousness. Mm-hmm. Now we know that there's always more than one human being in the mix, but let's just pretend for a moment that there's only two people. And one of these people have some perception, some consciousness. They want to transmit it to the other person. So communication turns out to be almost an inherent instinct that we have to express ourselves, to exchange ideas. Now, in the beginning, you could say that we use very simple ways of communicating. Something as simple as signs or sign language. That led to maybe symbols where people would draw things, and then, of course, speech or sounds, making sounds or speech itself. And all of that, the essence of communication is to transmit something from our consciousness, from an individual to another person, and that's the key, because then you move into the social domain of culture. Culture is a social phenomenon. It's not an individual phenomenon. So if I have my own concepts, my own consciousness, but I don't communicate it to anyone, you couldn't call that culture. It's just me and my thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay, so now that has to become dynamic. So moving from just the idea of communication, which is the second main ingredient, but now to take it to a social level, a higher order, that becomes conversation. So now we're going to have two-way conversation, whether it's signs against symbols or sounds or speech. But let's assume it's speech just for this conversation. So now it's the interaction between two people trying to make sense. And that's the whole key now to culture, because the conversation allows us to create the loop based on learning. Additional learning will impact consciousness, and then this cycle continues: consciousness, communication, conversation, and the cycle continues. So what kind of conversations can we have? One of the most critical conversations in any business is strategic conversations. Strategy is consciousness. Strategy is a knowledge. Strategy is some type of information you're trying to share with somebody else. So strategic conversation is one example of that happening. It's a dynamic between, two or more people, let's say. This is very consequential because without that aspect, there will be no additional learning. So now we move from consciousness, communication, conversation. It becomes consequential because we have group learning, and that also is part of the definition of culture. It's what a group learns over time that they believe they can have confidence in because it seems to work, and those ideas then go into their subconscious, and at the subconscious level you've got what we call tacit underlying assumptions, and that's the learning cycle. So the learning cycle really matches up very nicely with this concept, and that's what culture is. Without those three things, we couldn't even communicate the concept of culture. Anything else on that note?
I like it. And you came up with the 4 C's, if I understand right.
4 C's.
It starts with culture.
Culture.
Then it goes to consciousness.
Consciousness.
Which then leads over into the type of communication capability you have, which then goes to capability, right? And then there was another one which was
conversation.
Conversation.
Yes.
Sorry. Then consequential.
We said that's a consequential aspect of conversations. Yes.
Wow, that's a lot to put your head around. And on the far side of complexity, it's not that complex. Maybe the devil's in the details, like many things in life, but the sequential nature, the loop, as you called it, seems to be fairly straightforward.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Wow, Matt, you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you yet again for being on the show. And I'm Kit Owlitz. This is Dr. Matthew Chodkowski, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.